The genre of side-scrolling beat-em-ups was at a height in the early 1990s, but you probably already knew that if you watched my previous video game Odyssey on Streets of Rage, so let's skip all that. While the Streets of Rage series became Sega's most successful side-scrolling beat-em-up on the Sega Mega Drive, there was another trilogy, also a side-scrolling beat-em-up that achieved a similar success, but also spawned a number of spin-offs that you may not know about. So let's look at this series and see the twists and turns that it has gone through over the years. It's a Video Game Odyssey 4, Golden Axe. While Sega went into the home console business in 1983 with the release of the SG-1000, they still produced games and ports that would appear on other consoles, primarily the Atari and Commodore 64 systems, as well as numerous arcade releases. In 1989, they released Golden Axe in arcades, a side-scrolling beat-em-up in the style of some of the most popular games of the time, such as Double Dragon. The game is set in a fantasy world, inspired by films such as Conan, incorporating the Western high fantasy art style into its look. Golden Axe has you freeing the land of Uria from the armies of the evil Death Adder and recover the legendary Golden Axe from his possession. Choosing from one of 3 playable characters who have all had family members killed by Death Adder, Axe Battler, who doesn't actually use an axe to fight, Tyrus Flare, and Gilius Thunderhead, you travel across the land defeating Death Adder's army, saving villages, riding on the backs of giant animals before facing Death Adder himself. The combat is fairly simple, with a standard combo, jumping and jump attacks, and a special move used by pressing the jump and attack buttons together, which can defeat enemies behind you, which is very useful, as the AI constantly tries to get enemies either side of you. On top of this, a magic system allows you to unleash powerful spells that damage all enemies on screen, done by collecting blue jars dropped by the blue thieves. Each character requires a different number of jars to use their magic at different levels, giving a variety to the characters. You can also ride powerful beasts called Bizarrians that can breathe fire and deliver powerful attacks to enemies. If you think Bizarrians is a pretty bizarre name, then it should also be noted that one of the species is named Chicken Legs. Yes, you heard me, Chicken Legs. Anyway, overall it's a pretty solid game that looks, sounds and feels good to play, and would have been right at home in the arcade with its simple but addictive gameplay and support for 2-player cooperative mode. Naturally, owing to the success of the title, a sequel was released, along with a number of spin-offs. But before we get into those, we should take a look at the different ports of Golden Axe, and there are a lot of them. Golden Axe was released on nearly every available console in 1989, and some years after, resulting in 14 versions that are in some way different to one another, plus the 15th we'll address separately later. Let's take a brief look at them all. The Mega Drive version is very similar to the arcade version. It looks, sounds and plays almost identically to the original, although it improves on it by adding in a new survival mode, in which you face 15 waves of enemies of increasing difficulty, a junior mode, which is an easier difficulty comprising of only the first few stages, as well as a versus mode. The most important addition is the inclusion of an extra stage and an extra final boss. The only 2 things removed are the opening cutscene, in which your friend Alex is killed by Death Adder's forces. Perhaps his death was too violent to be included in the home release? The second change is the ending. In the arcade version, the enemy characters escape from the arcade machine they are played on to seemingly reap havoc in the real world, with the heroes following suit. Apparently, this was supposed to be the premise of a sequel, where you would defeat Death Adder's forces in the real world, but the sequels ultimately went in a different direction. Anyway, Golden Axe on the Mega Drive is perhaps the definitive version of the game, and probably the one you've played, as it is the one included on all subsequent collections and ported to modern consoles. The ZX Spectrum version of the game, developed by Virgin Games, is obviously limited by the specs of the console, but even with the bare bones graphics and lack of audio, it still ports the levels and gameplay as faithfully as it could. It also still retains the 2-player mode, which some of the versions failed to do. The game is notably based on the arcade version of the game, retaining the ending of that version, and not including the extra level of the Mega Drive version. A drawback of this version is that the difficulty is pretty severe, meaning that you probably won't see much of this game anyway. The Master System version also makes some cutbacks due to being an 8-bit console, but strangely seems to make a lot more than the other versions. For example, the only playable character is Tarek, who looks almost identical to Axe Battler, and you can choose to equip one of the free playable character's magic to use at the start of the game. Apart from that, the game is a fairly straightforward port, but leaves off the extra level of the Mega Drive version and lacks a 2-player mode. Other changes include offering a new ending and a slightly tweaked final stage. It plays how you would expect an 8-bit port to, and the gameplay holds up fairly well, but compared to the Streets of Rage Master System port, for example, which preserved all 3 playable characters of the Mega Drive version, its cutbacks seem a bit more abundant. The PC MS-DOS version is almost identical to the Mega Drive version. It retains the 2-player mode, Duel and Beginner modes, and has the extra level. The graphics have had a bit of a downgrade, but it is only very slight and would be a perfectly good way to get the Golden Axe experience. The version released for the PC CD TurboGrafx engine is one of the more unique versions. Its most notable feature is that it contains completely original cutscenes throughout the game that are not in any other version. Furthermore, each character has their own opening and ending cutscenes that give more background about the family members the Death Adder killed and their different stories. The whole game also has a completely different art style, going for a more Japanese style compared to the Western fantasy art that it was originally based around. The actual gameplay is very much similar to the other versions, and while the graphics aren't quite as good as the arcade and Mega Drive versions, are still colourful and capture the original feel close enough. Overall, it's an interesting version to check out if you want the story of the game fleshing out a little more. The Atari ST version, also developed by Virgin Games, is limited by the console's power. It doesn't run quite as well as other versions and feels poorly optimised. It does have a unique HUD display and is based on the arcade version, meaning it retains the original ending and does not have the extra level and boss. The Commodore 64 version is also based on the arcade version, and although limited by the system's power, is a fairly faithful adaptation that again has its own take on the HUD display. The most notable unique aspect of this version is its music, which was written for this version especially by Joran Tell, who wrote soundtracks for many popular Commodore games. The Amstrad CPC version is very limited, but is still colourful and faithful as can be, with again a unique HUD. It also retains the 2-player mode so you can co-op with your friends. This version is also based on the arcade version, and like that version, a co-op partner can drop in at any time. The Amiga version is based on the Mega Drive version, and while it retains a 2-player mode and the extra level, it does not feature the extra dual mode or easier difficulty. The graphics are only a minor downgrade, but the gameplay feels a bit more sluggish and slow. Nevertheless, it's still a decently playable version that has all the core elements retained within it. The Sega CD version, included on the Sega Arcade Classics compilation, is identical to the Mega Drive version, but rather oddly, there's no 2-player mode, which is strange considering co-op play is one of the big draws of the genre, and the Sega CD should have been able to incorporate it easily. The only other difference is that the voice clips from dying enemies have been changed to higher quality ones, owing to the Sega CD's increased disc size and audio capabilities. This might seem an odd change to make, and even stranger when you learn that the same thing was done in the Streets of Rage port to the Sega CD, also included on this compilation. Ow! The Game Boy Advance version, included with the Sega Smash Pack collection, is essentially the same as the Mega Drive version again, but it was built from scratch, as apparently the original source code was not available. Again, it's a fairly faithful recreation, but is limited graphically by the processing power of the handheld console. The Wonderswan Color version, released in 2002 in Japan only, is again a Mega Drive adaptation, retaining the extra modes but lacking a 2-player mode. It is limited somewhat in terms of the graphics, and the animations and controls feel a bit stiff, but it is perfectly playable. The only unique feature it has is the ability to save the game at the end of a level, giving you the opportunity to pick up where you left off. The Java mobile version, released in 2007, is about what you would expect from a mobile game of the time to be capable of. It preserves all the levels of the Mega Drive version and even includes the Duel mode, which features 12 waves of enemies to fight, unlocked for a character by clearing the game with them. The main drawback of the version is that the Bizarrians you can ride on have been removed entirely, and as you may imagine, playing the game with a phone keypad, as you would have had to in 2007, is not ideal. The game has a unique HUD like many of the versions, and also has a new combo meter and scoring mechanic, so you can record your high score and show it off. With all of those versions out of the way, we can start to look at some different games in the series. Let's start with Golden Axe, the handheld game from Tiger Electronic. This game plays like every Tiger handheld game that had a much more successful video game's name attached to it. You attack enemies that appear on all sides of the screen until you either beat the game or die, and it will most likely be the latter. These games were usually hard. If you've ever heard of or seen a Tiger handheld, you will know what to expect. Following Golden Axe's unquestionable success, a sequel was released on the Sega Mega Drive, and only the Sega Mega Drive, in 1991. Although technically an arcade version was released, it is the exact same game. The game features the return of the three playable characters of the previous game, Axe Battler, Tyrus Flare and Gilius Thunderhead, who this time are facing a new enemy, Dark Gold, who has taken possession of the legendary Golden Axe and unleashed his evil army onto the land. The most notable thing about Golden Axe 2 is that it's not notable at all. It's essentially just more of what its predecessor offered. Every change that the game makes is minor. Some of the moves have been altered slightly. The enemies are the same aside for one or two new additions. The characters have slightly tweaked attack ranges. The difficulty is slightly easier, and Axe Battler and Gilius have swapped magic elements for some reason. The magic system also allows you to use part of your stored magic, instead of having to use all of it at once in the original. But as mentioned, these are all minor changes and have no real effect on the core gameplay, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as the first was plenty successful, so there is no need to fix something that isn't broken. However, its minor changes do make the whole game feel somewhat unnecessary, especially if you compare it to Streets of Rage 2, a similar side-scrolling beat-em-up that improved on its predecessor in every way. When you think of Streets of Rage, you think of Streets of Rage 2, but if you think of Golden Axe, you'll think of the first game, and Golden Axe 2, while more of what made Golden Axe good, offers nothing new to succeed its predecessor and embody the title. Like Streets of Rage, Golden Axe 2 got a loose comic adaptation in the UK's Sonic the Comic, which, although primarily focused on Sonic the Hedgehog-based stories, would also feature adaptations of other Sega games in its early run. A 6-part story, Citadel of Dead Souls, ran in issues 1 to 6 in 1993 and served as a sequel to Golden Axe 2, in which the three heroes have to prevent Sorcerer Blackspell from resurrecting Dark Gold, the villain defeated at the end of the game. A second 6-part story, Plague of Serpents, ran in issues 13 to 18, which focuses on an original villain, Cobraxis, and his deadly snake cult, perhaps a reference to Death Adder, but none is made explicit. The heroes visit Gilius' home, the dwarven city of Rockguard, which is under attack by Cobraxis, and our heroes have to stop him. Although neither story is canon, they do a nice job of expanding the world of Golden Axe, something which the games themselves fail to do. Here's where things start to get a bit confusing. A second sequel was released in 1992, but it is a sequel to the first Golden Axe, not the second. Golden Axe, The Revenge of Death Adder, was released in arcades and, like the title suggests, features the return of Death Adder, the villain of the first game, and who was not featured in Golden Axe 2. Setting out to defeat him are 4 new playable characters: Stern, a barbarian who is similar to Axe Battler, Dora, a centaur, Pre, a young boy with a pitchfork, and Goa, a giant who fights with his fists. Gilius is the only playable character who makes a return, but only riding on Goa's back to use magic. If you want a sequel that improves on the original in every way, then Revenge of Death Adder is definitely the one you want to play. Aided by the 32-bit arcade system it is built on, the game has upgraded graphics, new vertical scrolling levels, multiple paths, a variety of new enemies and beasts to ride, and up to 4-player cooperative mode. Although some releases of the game were scaled back, and were limited to 2 or 3 player co-op, and dropped the need to take the alternate routes that you missed before you could face the final boss. I particularly like the animations for the magic attacks, which show enemies being turned to stone or otherwise obliterated, which just makes your attacks feel that much more powerful. I would go so far as to say this is probably the best Golden Axe game in the entire series. It does for Golden Axe what Streets of Rage 2 did for its predecessor, innovated and improved it in every way, while still retaining the core gameplay which made it so popular. As mentioned, this game is the second sequel to the first game, but must be considered non-canon in terms of the Golden Axe Mega Drive trilogy because, spoiler, the game ends with Gilius sacrificing himself to destroy Death Adder, and since Gilius appears in both Golden Axe 2 and 3, we must consider Revenge of Death Adder as a standalone entity, but as we shall see, continuity in the Golden Axe series is not too much to worry about. The only drawback with Revenge of Death Adder is that it was only an arcade release and never got ported to another system. Being a 32-bit game, it could not have been ported to the Mega Drive, but neither did it get ported to the Sega Saturn, which would have been an ideal home for it. The game finally got a re-release in 2020 on the Astro City Mini, a miniature arcade cabinet with a number of built-in Sega arcade games, including the original Golden Axe. It is a shame that this game's availability is so limited, as I genuinely believe it is the most authentic and complete Golden Axe experience. Returning back to the Mega Drive, the sequel to Golden Axe 2, Golden Axe 3, was released in 1993. It was released only in Japan, and in the US through the Sega Channel online subscription service. According to the original Japanese manual, Golden Axe 3 is set a long time after the events of the first Golden Axe, meaning that Axe Battler and Tyrus Flare have long since passed away, and Gilius is only alive due to dwarves having much longer lifespans. Gilius was on a journey to seal the Golden Axe away when the ship he was on capsized, and the axe was lost. When he recovers from his injuries 6 months later and able to continue his quest, he finds out that a new enemy with an awesome name, Damned Hellstrike, the Prince of Darkness, has conquered the nearby kingdoms of Eastland and Splash Hill, and also managed to gain possession of the Golden Axe. Mr. Hellstrike has also put a curse on 4 heroes, forcing them to do his bidding. These 4 heroes are the 4 new playable characters: Kane Grinder, who resembles Axe Battler, Sarah Byrne, who resembles Tyrus Flare, the giant Proud Cragger, and a humanoid panther named Kronos. A 5th character, Eve, a humanoid bird, is only playable in the game's Versus mode, and appears in the main game as a recurring character and boss. The game opens out with the character you select being released from Hellstrike's curse by Gilius to defeat the evil leader, or 2 of you if you play in 2-player cooperative mode. The rest of the characters you can encounter in the game as bosses, who you must defeat to release from Hellstrike's spell, and if you want to reach the true ending. You will have to save them, alongside not using too many continues before reaching the final stage, to get that true ending. The game is still a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and retains the ability from Revenge of Death Adder to choose multiple paths through the game, although if you want the true ending, you'll have to choose certain routes to find and defeat the other playable characters to free them. There have also been a number of additions to the gameplay, including the ability to guard attacks, earning extra lives through freeing prisoners, finishing moves, and unique moves and abilities for each character. The magic system strangely drops the ability to choose what level magic you use, returning to the original mechanic of using all your magic jars when you use your magic. Unfortunately, everything about this game feels vastly inferior to the previous 2. Just looking at the graphics, you can see nearly everything lacks detail, and is very poor looking for a 1993 Mega Drive game. The music too sounds very uninspiring. All of the additional gameplay and combat elements do nothing but complicate a game that should be simple and fun to play. For example, the guarding mechanic turns defeating some enemies into a long-winded and frustrating process. The game also feels a lot harder than the previous games, especially if you want the true ending, which requires you not to use up all of your continues and take the harder paths through the game. Overall, it just feels like a poor quality game, and you would expect something a lot better from Sega, and from one of its most notable franchises on the system. Perhaps Sega themselves thought the same, and that is why it wasn't commercially released outside of Japan. Outside of the main games released on the Mega Drive, There were a number of spin-offs released that reimagined the story of Golden Axe. First, Golden Axe Warrior was released on the Master System in 1991. The game has you take control of a young warrior whose parents were killed by Death Adder, and you must travel across the open world to defeat him and his army. It is quite easy to tell that this is heavily inspired by The Legend of Zelda on the NES, as you travel across the land gathering equipment and items, conquering the 9 labyrinths, yes, labyrinths, not dungeons, it's completely different, to collect the 9 crystals to restore peace to the land and confront Death Adder himself. The game also features the playable characters from Golden Axe as NPCs, who grant you different elemental magic to aid you in your quest. The world is quite large, and there's plenty to explore, but all in all it definitely pales in comparison to The Legend of Zelda in a number of ways. The combat is fairly repetitive and awkward, as your sword has a rather narrow hitbox, meaning it's easy to miss enemies straight in front of you, and enemies can take a fair few hits to defeat. The puzzles are also fairly uninspired, as they consist almost solely in hitting candlesticks on the walls in dungeons, labyrinths, to open doors. Most of your time spent in these labyrinths will consist of hitting every candlestick in every room just to see if it does anything. It's a perfectly playable game with a good length, but a lack of variety in the gameplay and the awkward combat does make it a frustrating experience at times. On the Game Gear, Axe Battler: A Legend of Golden Axe was also released in 1991. While Golden Axe Warrior was heavily inspired by The Legend of Zelda, Axe Battler: A Legend of Golden Axe is definitely inspired by Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Playing as Axe Battler, you travel across the top-down world, encountering random battles as you travel across the overworld. These battles take place in a side-scrolling screen, which feels more like a traditional Golden Axe game. You either defeat the enemy, or if you take a hit you are sent back to the map. The towns are also top-down, where you can gather items, clues, and learn new moves, and the dungeons are platforming levels that have you jumping across the levels, defeating all sorts of enemies. The story is essentially a retelling of the first Golden Axe game, with Axe Battler travelling on the back of a turtle, an eagle, and traversing the Fiend's Path similar to the levels of Golden Axe. It's fairly limited and short, being a Game Gear game, but the variety makes it an interesting game to play. Notably, there are no boss battles anywhere in the game. Even beating the last level just results in an ending cutscene without you having to actually fight Death Adder. The drawbacks are that the encounter rate is too high, meaning you get into battle on the overworld every few steps, and the platforming sections can be very tough as you essentially have to make it through in one go, and you only have a very small health pool, so you can make very few mistakes before you die and are sent back to the nearest town. It's an ambitious variety of gameplay that might have been successful on more powerful hardware, but as it stands, the different elements are very mixed and frustrating in their difficulty. Moving away from the 16-bit era, Golden Axe: The Duel was released in arcades and ported to the Sega Saturn, and is the franchise's attempt at a classic fighting game. At a time when side-scrolling beat-em-ups was starting to disappear as a genre in favour of fully 3D games, it perhaps made sense to pivot the franchise in this way. The story is a typical sort for fighting games. A group of warriors are fighting it out for a chance to claim the legendary Golden Axe, which has the power to make dreams come true. These warriors, unsurprisingly, make up the cast of playable characters, among them Gilius Rockhead, the great-grandson of the original Gilius Thunderhead, Death Adder himself, Cain Blade, who is probably meant to be Cain Grider from Golden Axe 3, Milan Flare, perhaps a relation to Tyrus Flare, and a host of new characters created specifically for the game. If this is your first fighting game, then you may find this tough going, as it's definitely not one for beginners. The opponents are fairly merciless even on the easier difficulties, and there are some fairly lengthy button inputs needed to pull off the best moves, so you really have to know your character to get the most out of them. For this reason, it is probably better to play the Saturn version, as it allows you to adjust the difficulty and other game options to suit your playstyle. No matter what you do though, it can be a steep learning curve for someone who is not familiar with fighting games. The game looks very good, the animation is smooth, and the characters are varied, if a little underwhelming as the majority of them have never been in a Golden Axe game before, or since. Each character also gets their own ending, so it adds a certain amount of replayability, but overall I think this is one for fighting game fans only. The next Golden Axe game appears in 2003 and is a 3D remake and technically the 15th version of the original Golden Axe. It was released on the PS2 in Japan only, as part of the Sega Ages collection in Japan, a series of 3D remakes of classic Sega games. Golden Axe has been entirely remade in 3D, and additional cutscenes and enemies have been added throughout the game, as well as a new duel mode which has you facing off a wave of 100 enemies in the quickest time possible. The game plays out without any real surprises, but there are a number of issues, including the game being much more difficult, which I count by spamming Gilius' rolling attack, which makes him invincible for most of its animation. The floating magicians, new enemies for this version, can be a nuisance as well, since they can be difficult to hit when in mid-air, and you have no real way to counter their ranged attacks. This is especially frustrating when they hover over a pit, which gives you no way to attack them. It's an okay remake that's nothing special, but the novelty of seeing this famous game in 3D for the first time is a nice novelty, but it certainly won't replace the original version in terms of popularity. The first and only truly 3D version of Golden Axe was released in 2008 on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Golden Axe Beast Rider is a reboot of the franchise and has you play as Tyris Flare, a member of the Exyrian priestesses who come under attack from the evil forces of Death Adder, who kidnaps the dragon titan that the priestesses worship. Tyris embarks on a quest of vengeance as she crosses Uria to defeat Death Adder's forces and reassemble the legendary Golden Axe. Gilius and Axe Battler do appear in the game, but only as side characters in the occasional cutscene. There's some nice nods to the original game in some of the locations and characters, but other than that, it is clearly meant to be a reboot of the franchise. Upon release, the game received poor reviews across the board, and is generally deemed a colossal failure, to which I would agree. Nearly everything about the game is dull, repetitive, or outright frustrating, and the lack of a co-op mode is unforgivable. The core gameplay, the combat system, is deeply flawed. It is mostly built upon you either dodging or parrying an enemy's attacks, but it is incredibly unreliable and often just leaves you taking a hit. It also falls apart if more than one enemy is attacking you at once, as you cannot dodge or parry more than one at a time. Given that there's no lock-on or targeting system, combined with the haphazard camera, it is all too easy to lose control of battles through no fault of your own. The game is split into smaller levels that take around 10 minutes to complete. They all mostly consist of the same thing, battling a group of enemies and running to the next battle, ad infinitum. The beast riding, a staple of the series and meant to be one of the core mechanics of this game, given that it is in the title, is awkward and clumsy as the beasts move slowly and it is too easy to be knocked off and have enemies take your mount, resulting in a tedious back and forth of you knocking each other off the beast. The magic system is fairly useless, as again there's no targeting system. Nearly all of the bosses are exactly the same, and the game looks like the typical Xbox 360 PS3 game of that era, with a colour palette consisting almost entirely of shades of brown, making it a very unappealing game to look at. There are some good points to the game. The gore and the dismemberments are pretty cool, but that's it really. The game ends with Tyris, Gilius and Axe Battler uniting as a new threat is about to emerge, setting up a sequel. But it never came. The game was a commercial and critical failure and has become largely forgotten, and it's difficult to say that it isn't deserved. Golden Axe Beast Rider is not worth your time, even if you're a hardcore fan of the series. This failure of Beast Rider seems to have put a halt to any revival of the franchise, as mentioned with the sequel being scrapped, and no new games since have been released or announced. As part of Sega's 60th anniversary, Golden Axe, a cancelled prototype, was released on Steam for free, which features the short playable level of a cancelled Golden Axe game, returning to its side-scrolling beat-em-up roots, but with 3D graphics. Being only a short demo of a very early build, it's difficult to say if the final product would have been good, but from what is playable, it seems fun enough, and the gore and dismemberments add a certain energy to the game that could have set it apart from other games in the genre. Unfortunately, the game never seems to have gotten any further than what was released on Steam, and even then, there was a controversy surrounding its release, as the developers had apparently not consented to Sega releasing the unfinished product, which the developers believed reflected badly upon them. Although we have yet to see any new games in the Golden Axe franchise, the characters have popped up in several other games. Gilius appears as a playable character in Sega Superstars Tennis and in Sega and All-Stars Racing Transformed. Gilius also appears in an episode of the anime Sega Hard Girls, in which a number of Sega characters make brief appearances. The characters from Golden Axe, including Def Adder, also appear in the mobile puzzle game Sega Heroes, but these brief glimpses of these characters are all we have gotten out of the franchise for many years. While Golden Axe as a franchise is still on hold, its constant cameos, mostly thanks to Gilius, and the porting of the Mega Drive trilogy onto modern consoles and PC, means that the series is never far away, and with the success of Streets of Rage 4, it's not necessarily out of the question that Golden Axe can make a shining comeback in the right hands. Thanks for watching this video game odyssey on Golden Axe. If you would like to see full playthroughs of the games I've mentioned in this video, you can check them out on my Twitch channel, where I play through all of the games live on stream. You can also support me over there by subscribing or checking out my Patreon. Links to all of these are listed below in the video's description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next Video Game Odyssey.